Oh, hey everyone. How's everyone weekend? How's everyone weekdays? How's Monday? Is it as tiring as the one I just got through? Got a lot of work to do. Got a lot of work done today, which I'm happy about, even if it's really tiring. I also managed to finish the Taylor Jenkins' new book, Atmosphere, which is it's okay, I guess. It could be better. It could be a lot better. But well, I'll talk about it more in my video about it. I want to start reading Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. Well, by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. It's two authors. And look at the size of that book. It's larger than my face. I don't think that's absurd. But it's only, I guess only is not really the right word, is 330 pages, at least from the book that I got. And the font is like that. Look at how small those letters are. So, it's going to take me a while to read this. I'm not gonna read it in one go, most likely. I'm going to split them in multiple read. I'm not going to read them all on stream, but this is an old book. It's from, let's see, 1988. That's an old book. It's what, 40 years ago? Almost? Yeah, almost 40 years ago. That's nuts. And it's still very relevant even today because manufacturing consent is still being done. I want to learn more about it, so that's why I got the book. I want to read about it. And I also want to try to make a good video of it if I could, because there's a lot of real world example that I could use. I just need to learn deeper about what it is, so at least I can communicate it better in my video. Okay, as usual with kind words and reading session, my reading session, and also my answering random strangers letter session. I will read as I play the game, as I reply to people's letter, hopefully help some people, maybe, yeah, hopefully. These are all the letters that I replied in the previous stream. Oh. Captain Astronaut. Dari tiket. a long distance. Okay, try to answer people's letter. Long distance. Okay, long distance. Long distance. Securities and relation is about securities. Obviously, distance previously acts because securities relation issue able in get upset. You read this. Sip. That's the limit of what I can say. Transfer 3 meter. Ini bisik. Okay. So they're already working in a working age at least, and customer service is rough. transactional. What's the word? When people try when people do good to others only so they also do good to them. Transactional? Is it transactional? Yeah, part of the problem is that people wanted a relationship but doesn't want to socialize, and relationship is something social. You cannot avoid socializing if you want a relationship. That's all I have. How to survive long distance relationship? Is this the same person as before? No, I don't have any answer for that. I can, but it's going to be hard. I don't think I have any friends that have survived long distance. Yeah, I don't think so. You know what? Let's give it. She is also the same person as the second letter answer. This is what I can give. Okay. This is such a heavy book. Okay. You know what? I can do this. Let's get rid of my thing further away so I can actually read. Okay, so this is manufacturing consent or manufacturing content, the political economy of the mass media by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. The tables are mainstream media usage of genocide for Kosovo, East Timor, Turkey, and Iraq. Financial data for 24 large media corporations of their parent firms, December 1986. Well, of the control group of 24 large media corporations or their parent companies, February 1986. Affiliation of the outside directors of 10 large media companies or their parents in 1986. Expert on terrorism and defense on Macmillan New Hour, January 14, 1985 to January 27, 1986. Chapter 2 is mass media coverage of worthy and unworthy victims. A murdered police priest versus 100 murdered religious in Latin America. The savageries inflicted on worthy and unworthy victims as depicted in the New York Times. And New York Times is one of the worst. Even in today's era, it's still manufacturing consent for a lot of the atrocity that America did in foreign countries. And sometimes even to their own. Mass media coverage of worthy and unworthy victims, a murdered police priest versus the murdered official of the Guatemalan Mutual Support Group. Chapter 3, topics included and excluded in the New York Times coverage of the Salvadoran election of March 25, 1984. Topics included and excluded in the New York Times coverage of the Nicaraguan election plan for November 4, 1984. Topics included and excluded in the New York Times coverage of the Nicaraguan election of November 4, 1984. Hey, that's the same thing. It's weird. Okay, so not that much then. There's only 3 chapters. Well, each chapter have about 3 or 4 sub-chapters, so that's still quite a lot. Oh, god damn it, that tables. The content itself is different. Okay, chapter 1 is a propaganda model. Chapter 2, worthy and unworthy victims. Chapter 3, legitimizing versus meaningless third world elections, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Chapter 4, the KGB Bulgarian plot to kill the Pope, remarket disinformation as news. Chapter 5, the Indo-China Wars, Vietnam. Chapter 6, the Indo-China Wars, Part 2, Laos and Cambodia. And then chapter 7 is conclusion. Okay, so 7 chapters then. Introduction. This book centers in what we call a propaganda model, an analytical framework that attempts to explain the performance of the US media in terms of the basic institutional structures and relationship within which they operate. It is our view that among their other functions, the media serve and propagandize on behalf of the powerful societal interests that control and finance them. This is their advertising basically. So a lot of at least legacy media in the West, a lot of them is very dependent on their advertising and also the donation that they got from various billionaires and various companies. That's why a lot of the most trusted news nowadays is from independent media, like that usually got their funds from the support of the people, like Dropsite, Democracy Now!, ZTO is a new one, and also the one that Taylor Lawrence made. And a lot of people currently is shifting away from mainstream news or legacy news because of that. The representatives of these interests have important agendas and principles that they want to advance, and they are well positioned to shape and constrain media policy. This is normally not accomplished by crude intervention, but by the selection of right-thinking personnel and by the editors and working journalists' internalization of priorities and definition of newsworthiness that conform to the institution's policy. With the genocide in Palestine, for example, in the New York Times, there's a leak from New York Times from their editing process that told basically the newsletter team there to not use certain words: ethnic cleansing, genocide, Palestine. Those words are banned from New York Times and a lot of other Western liberal media, and also conservative, to be fair, because both of them sucks in America. Structural factors are those such as ownership and control, dependence on other major funding sources, notably advertisers, as I mentioned, and mutual interest and relationship between the media and those who make the news and have the power to define it and explain what it means. The propaganda model also incorporates other closely related factors, such as the ability to complain about the media's treatment of news, that is, produce flag, to provide experts to confirm that officials slant on the news, and to fix the basic principles and ideologies that are taken for granted by media personnel and the elite, but are often irresisted by the general population. In our view, the same underlying power sources that own the media and fund them as advertisers that serve as primary definers of the news and that produce flag and property-king experts also play a key role in fixing basic principles and the dominant ideologies. We believe that what journalists do, what they see as newsworthy, and what they take for granted as premises of their work are frequently well explained by the incentive, pressure, and constraint incorporated into such a structural analysis. These structural factors that dominate media operation are not all controlling and do not always produce simple and homogeneous results. It is well recognized and may even be said to constitute a part of an institutional critique such as we present in this volume, that the various parts of media organizations have some limited autonomy, that individual and professional values influence media work, that policy is imperfectly enforced, and that media policy itself may allow some measure of dissent and reporting that calls into question the accepted viewpoint. These considerations all work to assure some dissent and coverage of inconvenient facts. The beauty of the system, however, is that such dissent and inconvenient information are kept within bound and at the margin, so that while their presence shows that the system is not monolithic, they are not large enough to interfere unduly with the domination of the official agenda. It should also be noted that we are talking about media structure and performance, not the effect of the media on the public. Certainly, the media's adherence to an official agenda with little dissent is likely to influence public opinion in the desired direction, but this is a matter of degree. And where the public interest diverges sharply from that of the elite, and where they have their own independent sources of information, the official line may be widely adopted. The point that we want to stress here, however, is that the propaganda model describes forces that shape what the media does. It does not imply that any propaganda emanating from media is always effective. And that's also what is currently happening a lot with the Israel-Palestine, because the propaganda around it has always been intense. A lot of lies, including Israel changing Palestine from desert into non-desert. No, that never happened. And a lot of the public perception of history, I think, right now has shifted into closer to the truth, and also a lot of public perception about what basically Western imperialists like US, UK, France have done has always been wrong, evil even. So the propaganda from those sides starting to be ineffective in a lot of ways, because now news does not just come from the usual same side. Though now more than 1,000 years old, both the propaganda model and the case studies presented with it in the first edition of this book have held up remarkably well. The purpose of this new introduction is to update the model, add some materials to supplement the case studies already in place and left intact in the chapters that follow, and finally to point out the possible applicability of the model to a number of issues under current or recent debate. Okay, that's the first part of the book. Is talk about the propaganda model that is from the legacy media, basically, and how involved the advertisers are on doing those propaganda, on causing those propaganda to be news. And for some writers. Can take note. At least that's what I do, or try to at least. AS1 because of our dogs. Hey, that's good. Yeah, that's all I got. Oh. that 3? I think that's 3, right? Okay. Let's continue with the book. Hey, happy birthday, Ike. It's not mine, so I assume it's theirs. Okay, so continuing the book, updating the propaganda model. The propaganda model, spelled out in detail in chapter 1, explains the broad sweep of the mainstream media's behavior and performance by their corporate character and integration into the political economy of the dominant economic system. For this reason, we focus heavily on the rise in scale of media enterprise, the media's gradual centralization and concentration, the growth of media conglomerates that control many different kinds of media, motion picture studios, TV networks, cable channels, magazines, and book publishing houses, and the spread of the media across borders in a globalization process. We also noted the gradual displacement of family control by professional managers serving a wider array of owners and more closely subject to market discipline. All of these trends and greater competition for advertising across media boundaries have continued and strengthened over the past dozen years, making for an intensified bottom-line orientation. Thus, centralization of the media in a shrinking number of very large firms has accelerated, virtually unopposed by Republican and Democratic administrations and regulatory authority. Ben Baktikian notes that when the first edition of his Media Monopoly was published in 1983, 50 giant firms dominated almost every mass medium, but just 7 years later, in 1990, only 23 firms occupied the same commanding position. Since 1990, a wave of massive deal and rapid globalization have left the media industries further centralized in 9 transnational conglomerates: Disney, AOL, Time Warner, Viacom, owner of CBS, News Corporation, Bertelsmann, General Electric, owner of NBC, Sony, AT&T Liberty Media, and Vivendi Universal. This giant owns all the world's major film studio, TV networks, and music companies, and a sizable fraction of the most important cable channels, cable system magazine, major market TV stations, and book publishers. The largest, the recently merged AOL Time Warner, has integrated the leading internet portal into the traditional media system. Another 15 firms run out the system, meaning that 2,000 firms control nearly the entirety of media experience by most US citizens. Baktikian concludes that it is the overwhelming collective power of these firms, with their corporate interlocks and unified cultural and political values, that raises troubling questions about the individual role in the American democracy. Of the 9 giants that now dominate the media universe, all but the General Electric have extensively conglomerated within the media and are important in both producing content and distributing it. 4 of them, Disney, AOL, Time Warner, Viacom, and News Corporation, produce movies, books, magazines, newspaper, TV programs, music, videos, toys, and theme parks, among other things, and they have extensive distribution facilities via broadcasting and cable ownership, retail stores, and movie theater chains. They also provide news and occasional investigative reports and documentaries that address political issues, but the leaders of these pop cultural behemoths are mainly interested in entertainment, which produce large audiences with shows like ABC TV's Who Want to Be a Millionaire and CBS TV Survivor, or with movies like Disney Lion King that also makes possible the cross-selling synergies that are a focal point of their attention and resources. Important branches of the media, such as movies and books, have had substantial global markets for many years, but only in the past 2 decades has a global media system come into being that is having major effect on national media system, culture, and politics. It has been fueled by the globalization of businesses more generally, The associated rapid growth of global advertising and improved communication technology that has facilitated cross-border operation and control. It has also been helped along by government policy and the consolidation of neoliberal ideology. Neoliberal again. The United States and other Western governments have pressed the interests of their home country firms eager to expand abroad, and the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and World Bank have done the same. The IMF, World Bank, NATO, and USA work in the interest of the American imperialism, mostly, or at least Western imperialism. Striving with considerable success to enlarge transnational corporate access to media markets across the globe, neoliberal ideology has provided the intellectual rationale for policies that have opened up the ownership of broadcasting stations and cable and satellite systems to private transnational investors. The culture and ideology fostered in this globalization process relate largely to lifestyle themes and goods and their acquisition, and they tend to weaken any sense of community helpful to civic life. Robert McChesney notes that the hallmark of the global media system is its relentless ubiquitous commercialism. Shopping channels, infomercial, and product placement are booming in the global media system. So product placement is in movies, music videos, etc., where if you can see the label of the product clearly, also in Instagram posts nowadays or a social media post, if you can see the label of the product clearly, it is almost always on purpose. Like for example, The Rock Instagram will always see his brand, like the Under Armour, and then also his tequila companies. So those are based in purpose there because it is advertisement, it is product placement. Same with movies and music videos. If you see Sony logo, for example, in music videos or airport, it is paid advertisement. Urusan. McChesney adds that it should come as no surprise that account after account in the late 1990s documents the fascination, even the obsession of the world middle-class youth with consumers' brand and products. The global media's news attention in the recent years, aside from reporting on crusades such as Operation Allied Force, the NATO war against Yugoslavia, and on national election, has been inordinately directed to sensationalism, as in their obsessive focus on the O.J. Simpson trial, the Lewinsky scandal, and the death of two of the West super celebrities, Princess Diana and John F. Kennedy Jr. Yeah, so a lot of those news was then broadcasted in all the existing media at that time. So the local news and the independent news that is trying to tell people about more important news like war crimes, actual war crimes done by the imperialists, is then buried among all the other viral news. That's why people who rely only on viral news usually don't really understand a lot about history, because it is on purpose that a lot of viral news is to cover up a lot of atrocities that is done throughout history. I think Vietnam news was one of those that got passed, and is very lucky that it got passed, because one, at that time, embedded journalism hasn't been that big of a thing, so a lot of journalists that went there then covered the news in a way that show the atrocities that is happening there. That's why a lot of people are against Vietnam wars or Vietnam invasion. And then Muhammad Ali, which is such a big figure in America at that time, is so firmly against joining the army, against committing war crimes basically. So it got a lot of coverage. That's why the protest against the Vietnam invasion started earlier than I think than what they planned. That's why America lost because they want to avoid the backlash in the country. But even if they lost the war, which is, I still put it as quotes because it's not a war, it's an invasion, they still put sanctions and embargoes on Vietnam to punish them. So yeah. And also, those a lot of the people who found out about the news about the Vietnam War didn't know about the sanction and the embargoes that is to punish the Vietnamese economically, because it is no longer in viral news. Globalization, along with the regulation and national budgetary pressure, has also helped reduce the importance of non-commercial media in country after country. This has been especially important in Europe and Asia, where public broadcasting systems were dominant, in contrast with the United States and Latin America. The financial pressure on public broadcasters has forced them to swing or emulate the commercial system in fundraising and programming. And some have been fully commercialized by policy change or privatization. The global balance of power has shifted decisively toward commercial system. James Ledbetter, what a name, points out that in the United States, under incessant right-wing political pressure and financial stringency, the 90s have seen a tidal wave of commercialism overtake public broadcasting, with public broadcasters rushing as fast as they can to merge with services with those offered by commercial networks. And in the process of what Ledbetter calls the mailing of public broadcasting, its always modest differences from the commercial network have almost disappeared. Most important in their programming, they share either the avoidance of or the defanging of contemporary political controversy, the kind that will bring trouble from powerful patrons. Yeah, the advertiser and the media often have a lot of these parties, right? Well, quote-unquote parties, dinner or meeting, basically, and since they are the client of the media, they can just yell at them if the news is bad against them, and then pull out the advertisement. So often they avoid some news because it is to avoid those kind of troubles. Some argue that the internet and the new communication technology are breaking the corporate stranglehold of journalism and opening an unprecedented era of interactive democratic media. And it is true and important that the internet has increased the efficiency and scope of individual and group networking. This has enabled people to escape the mainstream media's constraint in many and diverse cases. Japanese women have been able to tap newly created websites devoted to their problem, where they can talk and share experiences and information with their peers and obtain expert advice on business, financial, and personal matters. Chiapas resistors against abuse by the Mexican army and government were able to mobilize an international support base in 1995 to help them publicize their grievances and put pressure on the Mexican government to change its policies in the region. The enlarged ability of Bolivian peasants protesting against World Bank privatization program and user fees for water in 2000, and Indonesian students taking to the streets against the Suharto dictatorship in Indonesia in 1998 to communicate through the internet produced a level of publicity and global attention that had important consequences. Bestel Corporation, owner of the newly privatized water system in Bolivia that had quickly doubled water rates, backed off, and the privatization sale was rescinded. The protest and associated publicity, along with the 1998 financial crisis, helped drive Suharto from office. Broader protest movements have also benefited from the internet-based communication. When the leading member of the World Trade Organization, WTO, attempted in 1998 to push through in secret a multilateral agreement on investment that would have protected further the rights of international investors as against the right of democratic bodies within states, the internet was extremely valuable in alerting opposition forces to the threat and helping mobilize an opposition that prevented acceptance of this agreement. Similarly, in the protest actions against the WTO meeting in Seattle in November 1999, and the IMF and World Bank annual gathering in Washington DC in April 2000, communication via the internet played an important role both in organizing the protests and in disseminating information on the events themselves that countered the mainstream media hostile portrayal of these protests. Yeah, a lot of protests back in the day used to be exaggerated. Of course, the Palestinian movement have also been subject to this. Before the second Intifada, there's the first Intifada, and before the first Intifada, there's a lot of other protests, peaceful protests that has happened. But those are mostly forgotten because it's not in the news or exaggerated by the news. Same with a lot of green protests. If you remember movies, I think even to this day, but since the 80s, since the 90s, movies where they have what is basically called a tree hugger back there. The movies, the protests against oil companies and against animal abuse and deforestation is always painted as violent, even though historically the only violent one that we have is only the one person that is the most famous of them all, the Unabomber. That's the one. Besides that, everything else is mostly peaceful, except for those new guys that is starting to throw eggs at painting. But that's new. Let me take some tea break because I've been drinking. I also need to check my mail. There's some email, but it's not that important for me. I'll read it later. I need to go to the toilet for a bit. Okay. I've read for basically an hour. Well, maybe half an hour. And I'm still at the introduction page. There's still this many before I go to the first chapter. That's awesome. Yeah, it's going to take me a while to read that. But I'm learning a lot already, even if just at the introduction, so I'm happy with that. Okay, let's answer some more letters. There's anything besides blue sky? Oh, I don't think so. Okay, that's one. Okay, so the guy is just have a bit of a fetish. This guy's just horny. Please, not the same guy. Okay. too much of a platitudes. Okay, let's read some more. Where was I? Yeah, the internet. However, although the internet has been a valuable addition to the communication arsenal of dissidents and protesters, it has limitations as a critical tool. For one thing, those whose information needs are most acute are not well served by the internet. Many lack access. Its databases are not designed to meet their needs, and the use of databases and effective use of the internet in general presuppose knowledge and organization. The internet is not an instrument of mass communication for those lacking brand names, an already existing large audience, and/or large resources. Only sizable commercial organizations have been able to make large numbers aware of the existence of their internet offerings. The privatization of the internet hardware, the rapid commercialization and concentration of internet portals and servers, and their integration into non-internet conglomerates, the AOL-Time Warner merger, was a giant step in that direction. The private and concentrated control of the new broadband technology together threaten to limit any future prospect of the internet as a democratic media vehicle. The past few years have witnessed a rapid penetration of the internet by the leading newspaper and media conglomerates, all fearful of being outflanked by small pioneer users of the new technology and willing and able to accept losses for years while testing out these new waters. Anxious to reduce these losses, however, and with advertisers leery of the value of spending in a medium characterized by excessive audience control and rapid surfing, the large media entrants into the internet have gravitated to making familiar compromises, more attention to selling goods, cutting back on news, and providing features immediately attractive to audiences and advertisers. The Boston Globe, a subsidiary of the New York Times and the Washington Post, are offering e-commerce goods and services, and Ledbetter notes that it's troubling that none of the newspaper portal feels that quality journalism is at the center of its strategy, because journalism doesn't help you sell things. Former New York editor Max Frankel says that the more newspapers pursue internet audiences, the more will sex, sports, violence, and comedy appear on their menus, slighting, if not altogether ignoring, the news of foreign wars or welfare reform. New technologies are mainly introduced to meet corporate needs, and those of recent years have permitted media firms to shrink staff even as they achieve greater outputs. They have made possible global distribution systems that reduce the number of media entities. The audience interaction, facilitated by advancing interactive capabilities, mainly help audience members to shop, but they also allow media firms to collect detailed information on their audiences, and thus to fine-tune program features and ads to individual characteristics, as well as to sell by a click during programs. Along with reducing privacy, this should intensify commercialization. In short, the changes in politics and communication over the past dozen years have tended on balance to enhance the applicability of the propaganda model. The increase in corporate power and global reach, the mergers and further centralization of the media, and the decline of public broadcasting have made bottom-line consideration more influential both in the United States and abroad. The competition for advertising has become more intense, and the boundaries between editorial and advertising department have weakened further. Newsrooms have been more thoroughly incorporated into transnational corporate empires, with budget cuts and a further diminution of management enthusiasm for investigative journalism that will challenge the structures of power. Over the past dozen years, sourcing and flag have also strengthened as mechanism of elite influence. Media centralization and the reduction in the resources devoted to journalism have made the media more dependent than ever on the primary definers who both make the news and subsidize the media by providing accessible and cheap copy. They now have greater leverage over the media, and the public relations firms working for this and other powerful interests also broke larger as media resources. Alec Carey, Stuart Ewan, John Stauber, and Sheldon Rampton have helped us see how the public relations industry have been able to utilize journalistic convention to serve its and its corporate client needs. Studies of news sources reveal that a significant proportion of news originates in public relations releases. There are, by one account, 2,000 more public relations agents working to doctor the news today than there are journalists writing it. Yeah, that sounds right. That sounds correct. The force of anti-communist ideology have possibly weakened with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the virtual disappearance of socialist movement across the globe. But this is easily offset by the greater ideological force of the belief in a miracle of market reaction. The triumph of capitalism and the increasing power of those with an interest in privatization and market rule have strengthened the grip of market ideology, at least among the elite, so that regardless of evidence, markets are assumed to be benevolent and even democratic, market populism in Thomas Frank's phrase. And non-market mechanisms are suspect, although exceptions are allowed when private firms need subsidies, bailouts, and government help in doing business abroad. When the Soviet economy stagnated in the 1980s, it was attributed to the absence of markets. When capitalist Russia disintegrated in the 1990s, this was blamed not on the now ruling market but on politicians and worker failure to let market work their magic. Journalism has internalized this ideology, adding it to the residual power of anti-communism in a world in which the global power of market institutions makes non-market options seem utopian, gives us an ideological package of immense strength. These changes, which have strengthened the applicability of the propaganda model, have seriously weakened the public sphere, which refers to the array of places and forums in which matters important to a democratic community are debated and information relevant to intelligent citizen participation is provided. The steady advance and cultural powers of marketing and advertising has caused the displacement of a political public sphere by a depoliticized consumer culture, and it has had the effect of creating a world of virtual communities built by advertisers and based on demographics and taste differences of consumers. This consumption and style-based clusters are at odds with physical communities that share a social life and common concerns and which participate in a democratic order. These virtual communities are organized to buy and sell goods, not to create or serve a public sphere. Advertisers dominate the public sphere, but audiences are relatively small, upsetting controversy take place, and the settings are not ideal for selling goods. Their preference for entertainment underlies the gradual erosion of the public sphere under system of commercial media, well exemplified in the history of broadcasting in the United States over the past 75 years. But entertainment has the merit not only of being better suited to helping sell goods, it is an effective vehicle for hidden ideological messages. Furthermore, in a system of high and growing inequality, entertainment is the contemporary equivalent of the Roman games of the circus that diverts the public from politics and generate a political apathy that is helpful to preservation of the status quo. It would be a mistake to conclude from the fact that the public buys and watches the offerings of the increasingly commercialized media that the gradual erosion of the public sphere reflects the preferences and free choices of the public either as citizens or consumers. The citizenry was never given the opportunity to approve or disapprove the wholesale transfer of broadcasting rights to commercial interests back in 1934, and the pledge made by those interests and subsequently by Federal Communications Commission (FCC) itself that public service offerings would never be buried in favor of the entertainment preferred by advertisers was never fulfilled. The public is not sovereign over the media. The owners and managers seeking ads decide what is to be offered, and the public must choose among these. People watch and read in good parts on the basis of what is readily available and intensely promoted. Polls regularly show that the public would like more news, documentaries, and other information, and less sex, violence, and other entertainment, even as they do listen to and watch the latter. There is little reason to believe that they would not like to understand why they are working harder with stagnant or declining incomes, have inadequate medical care at high cost, and what is being done in their name all over the world. If they are not getting much information on this topic, the propaganda model can explain why. The sovereign who control the media choose not to offer such material. Yeah. That's why a lot of media that is becoming viral, a lot of them is also manufactured because it is selected from what the provider give. Even in the internet era, the algorithm is built so that people focus more on entertainment for the masses, entertainment that makes you not have to use your brain to think, just entertainment for the sake of entertainment, basically. That's why my videos that shows a lot of books don't get a lot of views too. That's also because my channel is very new and I'm still really bad at this. But still, even so, you can see from various channels that is more educational is getting less views because the algorithm doesn't boost those compared to contents that is made to make you think less. Make you forget, to make you feel apathetic to the world and to the plight that you are going through, and also the plight that other people are going through. Speaking of other people, let's read some more letters. Trying a fan. Do I have something to say with that? I don't think so. That's all I have. This one. Okay. Let's read more. How many pages have I gone through? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 pages. Okay, updating the case studies. In the case studies presented in chapter 2 through 6, we examined the differences in treatment of situations broadly similar in character, except for the political and economic interests at stake. Our expectation is that news as well as editorial opinion will be strongly influenced by those interests and should display a predictable bias. We would anticipate, for example, that an election held by a client state government or favored by US officials would be treated differently by the media than an election held by a government that US officials oppose. It will be seen in chapter 3 that in the important election analyzed the artistic this dichotomous treatments and bias was displayed to an extraordinary degree. Worthy and unworthy victims. In chapter 2, we compare the media's treatment of victims of enemy states and those of United States and US client states. Yeah, basically just like currently Israel and Palestine, right? Or in the new Superman, you know, the two states. That is basically Israel and Palestine. Our prediction is that the victim of enemy states will be found worthy and will be subject to more intense and indignant coverage than those victimized by the United States or its client, who are implicitly unworthy. It is shown in chapter 2 that 1984 victims of the Polish communists, the priest Jerzy Popieluszko, not only received far more coverage than Archbishop Oscar Romero, murdered in the US client state El Salvador in 1980. He was given more coverage than the aggregate of 100 religious victims killed in US client state, although 8 of those victims were US citizens. Yeah. The US doesn't really care about its citizens, whether it's from the conservative side or the liberal side. The system of imperial must be held at all costs. This bias is politically advantageous to US policymakers for focusing on victims of enemy states, show those states to be wicked and deserving of US hostility. Korea, North Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Iran, Cuba, Libya. There's so many states that the US have intervened and made worse than what they are. While ignoring US and clan state victims allow ongoing US policies to proceed more easily, unburdened by the interference of concern over the politically inconvenient victims. It is not a credible reply that difficulty in getting evidence on unworthy victims can account for the application of such a gross double standard. As an alternative, press with meager resources have been able to gather a great deal of material on their mistreatment from highly credible sources, such as major human rights organizations and church representatives. Furthermore, only political factors can explain the differences in quality of treatment of worthy and unworthy victims noted throughout this book, illustrated in Chapter 2 by the more antiseptic reporting of the abuse of unworthy victims, even US women raped and murdered in El Salvador, and the greater indignation and search for responsibility at the top in the case of worthy victims. That the same massive political bias displayed earlier in the coverage of Populusco and the 100 religious victims in Latin America continues today is suggested by the media usage of the word genocide in the 1990s, as shown in the accompanying table. Genocide is an invidious word that officials apply readily to cases of victimization in enemy states, but rarely, if ever, to similar or worse cases of victimization by the United States itself or allied regimes, thus with Saddam Hussein and Iraq having been US targets in the 1990s, whereas Turkey has been an ally and client, and the United States its major arms supplier, as it engaged in its severe ethnic cleansing of Kurds during those years. We find former US Ambassador Peter Galbraith stating that while Turkey represses its own Kurds, its cooperation is essential to an American-led mission to protect Iraq Kurds from renewed genocide at the hands of Saddam Hussein. Turkey's treatment of its Kurds was in no way less murderous than Iraq's treatment of Iraqi Kurds, but for Galbraith, Turkey only repressed while Iraq engaged in genocide. Yeah, even now, the US still, and not just the US, most of the NATO alliance, basically Western imperialism, US, UK, German, France, a lot of them still refuse to officially state that what the Israel does to the Palestinian is genocide. But if it's for their own interest, even if it's not genocide, they'll call it genocide. If it's against their interest, if it's against the imperialism will, they are so quick to judge it and exaggerate its judgment even. Itu kok The table shows that the five major print media surveyed engage in a similar bias usage, frequently using genocide to describe victimization in the enemy states, but applying the word far less frequently to equally severe victimization carried out by the United States or its allies and clients. We can even read who are US friends and enemies from the media's use of the word. Thus, with the United States and its NATO allies warring against Yugoslavia in 1999, allegedly in response to that country's mistreatment of the Kosovo Albanians, official denunciation of that mistreatment flowed through the media, along with the repeated designation of the abuses as genocidal. The same pattern applies to the Iraqi regime abuse of its Kurdish population. After it had ceased to be a US ally, an enemy state, official denunciation, harsh sanction, and parallel media treatment. The US aid is basically just a chain that the United States and its allies use to make sure that the country that they are sending aid to is beholden to them. Right now, there is the only alternative beside US aid that is large enough is, I forgot the name. I think it's China's railroad or something. But it's not on a global scale yet because it is trying to build a bridge between the various countries that is neighbor to China by building railroads and factories and everything. It still had a lot of flaws, but it's already so much better compared to USA that the African is basically having a saying in their country that said that when China comes, we got hospital, trains. When America comes, we got a lesson. Which is fortunate, but also unfortunate since we still have to rely on superpowers. On the other hand, Turkey and Indonesia have long been US allies and client states and recipients of military and economic aid. In consequence, and just as the propaganda model would predict, the media not only gave minimal attention to the severe abuse of the Kurds by Turkey throughout the 1990s, and to the Clinton administration's lavish help to Turkey's implementation of that ethnic cleansing program, they rarely applied the word genocide to these Turkish operations. Similarly, the word was not often applied to the Indonesian mistreatment of the East Timorese, who were subjected to another wave of terror as Indonesia tried to prevent or defeat a UN-sponsored referendum on independence in 1999. The United States, after helping Suharto take power in 1965, is one of the great bloodbaths of the 20th century, and after supporting his dictatorship for 32 years, also gave him crucial military and diplomatic aid when he invaded and occupied East Timor from 1975. In 1999, as Indonesia attempted to prevent the independence referendum in East Timor by violence, the United States maintained its military aid programs and refused to intervene to stop the killing, on the ground that what is happening is the responsibility of the government of Indonesia. We don't want to take that responsibility away from them, as stated by Defense Secretary William Cohen in a press conference of September 8, 1999. This was long after Indonesia had killed thousands and destroyed much of East Timor. Shortly thereafter, under considerable international pressure, the United States invited Indonesia to leave the devastated country. We have shown elsewhere that in 1975 and later the US media treated the East Timorese as unworthy victims, saving their attention and indignation for the almost simultaneous killings under Pol Pot in Cambodia. The victims of Pol Pot, a communist leader, were worthy, although after he was ousted by the Vietnamese in 1978. Cambodia ceased to be worthy as US policy shifted toward support of Pol Pot in exile. The East Timorese remained unworthy in the 1990s, as the table suggests. As the leader of the faction insisting on harsh sanctions against Iraq following the 1991 Persian Gulf War, the United States itself was responsible for a very large number of Iraqi civilians dead in the 1990s. John and Carl Mueller assert that the sanctions of mass destruction have caused the death of more people in Iraq than have been slain by all so-called weapons of mass destruction, nuclear and chemical, throughout all history. A large fraction of the millions of more killed by sanctions were young children. UNICEF Executive Director Carol Bellamy pointed out that if the substantial reduction in child mortality throughout Iraq during the 1980s had continued throughout the 1990s, there would have been 500,000 fewer deaths of children under 5 in the country as a whole during the 8-year period of 1991 to 1998. However, as this death resulted from US policy, and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright declared on national television that these 500,000 child deaths were worth it, we would expect the US media to find these victims unworthy, to give them little attention and less indignation, and to find the word genocide inapplicable to this case. The table shows that this expectation was realized in media practice. And I think that's why a lot of the coverage of the Israel-Palestine, there are not a lot, but some coverage of it mention the number of certain words used in liberal media like liberal and conservative media, CNN, Fox News, New York Times, and a lot of them use Palestinian much less often compared to the use of Israel, and they use Hamas much more often compared to the IDF when they describe about certain action. It's very one-sided. Good advice. I've read some more letters. I also want to raise my voice. Too much. Let's do one more. 7. Let's see. Do I want to continue streaming? Maybe half an hour again. I made it somewhere. I do still want to continue reading. The case for severe media bias suggested by the usage of genocide shown in the table is strengthened by the fact that despite the great media attention to and indignation over the views of the Kosovo Albanians by the Serbs in 1998 to 1999, this mistreatment was almost certainly less severe than that meted out to the Kurds in Turkey in 1990s and to the East Timorese by the Indonesian army and paramilitary forces in East Timor in 1999. Deaths in Kosovo on all sides in the year before the NATO bombing were estimated by US and other Western sources to number no more than 2,000, and the Serb assault and explosion that followed and accompanied the NATO bombing campaign also appeared to have resulted in deaths in the low thousands. An intensive post-war search for graves had yielded some 3,000 bodies by August 2000. Not all of them Albanian civilians or necessarily victims of the search. Deaths in the Turkish war on the Kurds in the 1990s were estimated to be 3,000 or more, a large fraction Kurdish civilian with refugee numbers running to 2 to 3 million. In East Timor, where the Indonesian military organized and collaborated with the paramilitary opposition to a UN-sponsored independence referendum held on August 30, 1999, an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 East Timorese civilians were slaughtered even before the referendum vote that rejected Indonesian rule, which unleashed a furious Indonesian army paramilitary assault on East Timorese. The double standard reflected in the politicized use of genocide is applicable to the treatment of news events more broadly, with the media regularly focusing on the abuse of worthy victims and playing down or neglecting altogether the plight of unworthy victims. As an illustration, we may consider the contrasting media treatment of the alleged killing of some 40 Albanians by the Serbs at Racak, Kosovo on January 15, 1999, and the Indonesian army militia killing up to 200 East Timorese at Lake Kuika in East Timor on April 6, 1999. The former was seen as useful by US officials who were trying to ready the US and Western publics for an imminent NATO attack on Yugoslavia. Although the facts in the Racak killings, which occurred in the course of fighting between the Serbian military and Kosovo Liberation Army insurgents within Yugoslavia, were and remain in dispute, and recent evidence raises further doubts about the NATO KLA account of events there. The deaths were immediately denounced and featured by US and NATO officials as intolerable massacre. The US mainstream media did the same and gave this reported massacre heavy and uncritical attention. This helped create the moral basis for the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia that began on March 24, 1999, manufacturing consent, that is. The Lake Kuika killing of East Timorese seeking refuge in a Catholic church by Indonesian organized militia forces were indisputably a massacre, apparently involved many more victims than at Racak, and it took place in a territory illegally occupied by a foreign state, Indonesia. It was also neither a unique event nor was it connected to any warfare, as in Kosovo. It was a straightforward slaughter of civilians, but US officials did not denounce this massacre. In fact, active US support of the Indonesian military continued throughout this period and up to a week after the referendum, by which time 85% of the population had been driven from their homes and well over 6,000 civilians have been slaughtered. The US mainstream media followed the official lead. For a 12-month period following the date of each event, the mention of Rajak by 5 media entities cited in the table exceeded mention of Liquica by 4.1 to 1, and the mentions of massacre at the two sites were in a ratio of 7.7 to 1. The greater length of accounts of the Rajak events elevates the ratio to 14 to 1 as measured by word count. Newsweek, which mentioned Rajak at its massacre 9 times, failed to mention Liquica once. Thus, with the cooperation of the media, the Rajak killings were ineffectively used by US officials to ready the public for war, not only by their intensive coverage, but also by their taking the official allegation of massacre at face value. In the same time frame, the media treatment of the indisputable massacre at Liquica was insufficient in volume or indignation to mobilize the public, in accord with the US policy of leaving the management of events in East Timor to the US ally Indonesia. Yeah, Indonesia is still involved in a lot of US massacre, especially, not just especially, during Suharto race and all along his 4 decades, I think, of regimes. He's one of the most long-running dictator of all time because of US backing. I'll take a big break. I'll get some more water to drink, because my throat is so parched from reading. Then I'll read some more letters. I'm back. Anything I miss? Nothing? Sorry about that. Cables as usual. Okay, let's read some letters and then read one more parts of the book and then read more letters. Then I think that's it. other games that have a similar feeling to one shot. But the guy make it sounds like he's facing a ghost or something. Okay, one more before I start. Go back to reading books. Okay, let's read one more time. The leak will shine. You see? Damn, my lips is so dry today. See how long this part is. Not that much. Legitimizing versus meaningless third world elections. Yeah, also a lot of dictators in the world is placed by Western imperialism by either funding the more corrupt officials or staging a coup and funding it again, or straight up assassinating the political opponent of the opposition. Lumumba in Africa is one that always easy off the top of my head, but there are more examples of those. Fidel Castro, also there's like 67 or a few hundred attempts at assassinating him. America is weird. In chapter 3, we show that the mainstream media have followed a government agenda in treating elections in client and disfavored states. In El Salvador in the 1980s, the US government sponsored several elections to demonstrate to the US public that our intervention there was approved by the local population, whereas the Nicaraguan held an election in 1984. The Reagan administration tried to discredit it to prevent legitimation of a government the administrator was trying to overthrow. The mainstream media cooperated, finding the Salvadoran election a step toward democracy and the Nicaraguan election a sham, despite the fact that electoral conditions were far more compatible with an honest election in Nicaragua than in El Salvador. We demonstrate that the media applied a remarkable dual standard to the two elections in accord with the government propaganda needs. The same bias is apparent in the press treatment of more recent elections in Cambodia, Yugoslavia, Kenya, Mexico, Russia, Turkey, and Uruguay. Cambodia and Yugoslavia were the only two of these 7 ruled by a party strongly objectionable to US policymakers, and it is in these cases that the New York Times warned of serious problem. As regards Cambodia, it asserted that flawed elections are worse than none, and that the international community must proceed cautiously, lest a rigged election gave Mr. Hun Sen a veneer of legitimacy. In reporting on the Yugoslavian election of September 2000, in which US officials intervened openly to prevent the re-election of Slobodan Milosevic, the Times and media in general repeatedly warned of the possibility of fraud and a rigged election. In the case of Kenya, where US policies toward the ruling government was ambivalent, here also the Times was skeptical of election quality, noting that holding election is not enough to assure democratic government, and stressing the need for an independent electoral commission less bound to political parties and independent broadcast media allowing opposition voices to be heard outside election periods. But in the other 4 elections, organized and won by governments strongly favored by the US State Department, there were no suggestion that flawed elections are worse than none, and no featuring of the threat of fraud. The importance of an independent electoral commission and broadcast media was not pressed, and in each case, the election was found to be a step toward democracy and hence legitimizing. In the case of Mexico, long subject to one party, PRI rule, but supported by the US government over the past several decades, the Times has regularly found the Mexican election encouraging. In contrast with past fraudulent ones, at the time, the editors also contrasted favorably with those in the more distant past. It has featured expression of benevolent intent and downplayed structural defects and abuses. Thus, in its first editorial on the 1988 election that brought Carlos Salinas de Gortari to power, the Times noted that prior elections were corrupt. The PRI manipulated patronage, the news media, and the ballot box, but it stressed that PRI candidate Salinas contends that political reform is urgent and calls for clean election. The editors questioned whether his party will heed his pleas, a process of distancing the favored candidate from responsibility for any abuses to come. In the editorials that followed, the Times did not suggest possible ongoing electoral fraud or manipulated patronage or media controls and bias, although this election was famous for a convenient computer breakdown. In the election aftermath, which turned Carlos Salinas from an expected loser into a winner, just 3 years later, however, at the time of the 1991 election, the editor stated that as long as anyone can remember, Mexican elections have been massively fraudulent, as it prepared readers for new promises of a cleanup. But all through this period and later, the Times and its media rivals did not focus on fraud or call this election rigged. In both news stories and editorials, they portrayed this deeply flawed election as steps toward democracy and legitimacy. In the 1983 Turkish election, held under military rule, with harsh censorship and only 3 parties, led by politicians sympathetic to the military government allowed to run, the Times found that Turkey approached democracy similarly in Uruguay 1984 election, under another military regime that jailed the leading opposition candidate and also refused to allow a second major candidate to run, but organized by a government approved by the US State Department. The Times once again found that Uruguay is resuming its democratic vocation. The generals are yielding to the infectious resurgence of democracy in much of Latin America. The Russian election of 1996 was important to the United States and its allies as Boris Yeltsin, the ruler who was carrying out their favored policies of privatization and the integration of Russia into the global financial system, was seriously threatened with defeat. The Yeltsin government has presided over a 50% fall in national output and large income declines for 90% of the population, while the hugely corrupt privatization process provided windfall to a small minority, including an important criminal class. The social welfare and healthcare system has disintegrated under Yeltsin rule, contributing to a startling rise in infectious diseases and mortality rates. Just before the 1996 election campaign, Yeltsin's popularity rating was 8%. That he could win re-election in such circumstances suggests and reflects a seriously flawed elections. Yeah. 90% vote of unpopular and then winning the election, that's okay. However, with the Yeltsin regime strongly backed by the US government and its Western allies, again with this, they did a lot of this also with NATO help. Vietnam, they separated Vietnam into North and South, with the North being led by Ho Chi Minh and the South being led by US elected president. And North Korea is also the same. The first South Korean president was also US backed, Syngman Rhee. He did a lot of massacre towards his own population, towards South Korean, but because he's US ally, a lot of these massacres doesn't go into the news. For their paper of record, electoral flaws were slighted or ignored, and its editors declared the very fact of holding an imperfect election a remarkable achievement. The same bias was evident in reporting on the March 2000 Russian election, won by Yeltsin's anointed heir and former KGB operative Vladimir Putin. Putin had built his popularity by conducting a brutal counterinsurgency war against Chechnya, and his electoral success rested heavily on the fact that the powerful state TV and radio station campaigned furiously on his behalf and denigrated and gave no broadcasting time to his opponents. A September 2000 exposure of the Putin election campaign by the expatriate Moscow Times, based on a 6-month investigative effort, uncovered compelling evidence of election fraud, including ballot stuffing, ballot destruction, and the creation of 1.3 million dead souls inflating the election rolls. The US mainstream media, however, never found any evidence of fraud at the time of the election, and they have been reluctant to report the finding of the Moscow Times study. Putin is another reformer, like Yeltsin, supported by the West, so that it follows once again that for the mainstream media, a flawed election, hardly admitted to be flawed, remained better than none. And also, a lot of the time, the US, in preparation of attacking another country, usually villainize the country they are planning to attack. That's why there's like a lot of coverage of negative coverage about China in the US and a lot of the Western country, because they too are preparing to one day take care of the China problem, just like the Jew problem from the German or the Palestinian problem from the Israel. Okay, let's answer 3 more later, and then I think that's it for my stream today. I cannot read another letter.
Let's read it.
Okay, so CPTSD is chronic post-trauma. It's most likely. But who's having the CPTSD here? I think that's it for my letters. That is for my reading. That's it for my stream. I hope that's enjoyable to you guys. I need to read this some more, but I don't think it will be today because I do need to rest. Tomorrow I have a meeting with HR in my company. I have documents to take care of tomorrow at job. Oh, new sticker before I went off. The icon and on and on. Cool. Yeah, that's it for the stream. Thank you everyone for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.